The sheer geometry of the Alaska Range imposes an absolute physical limit on both aviation and ground recovery operations. When an aircraft vanishes into this terrain, the initial search objective is pure localization against severe geographical constraints. On September 18, 1944, a United States Army Air Force's Douglas C-47, a Skytrain, vanished into this remote environment. The heavy transport held military registration 4315738. It had departed Elmendorf Field in Anchorage, bound for Ladd Field in Fairbanks. Contemporary accounts describe 19 people aboard, 1 civilian pilot from Northwest Airlines and 18 servicemen. In the storm and the mountains, all 19 disappeared along with the airframe. A routine transport flight over the Alaska interior demands precise navigation through designated mountain passes. Failing to maintain these established corridors places an aircraft directly over unforgiving topography. When the Skytrain failed to arrive at Ladd Field, coordinators had to narrow the loss point inside a vast grid of ice and rock. Locating 19 missing personnel in the remote wilderness requires identifying a microscopic debris field against a vast, continuous background of white ice and dark rock. Search coordinators must analyze the intended flight path and calculate possible deviations based on weather avoidance or navigation errors. Aircraft flying reconnaissance missions must operate near their own performance ceilings while scanning complex, narrow valleys. Finding the exact point of loss dictates whether a recovery operation is even geometrically possible. After extended aerial search efforts, reconnaissance flights secured a vital knowledge gain. The missing airframe was successfully pinpointed deep inside the mountain range. The crash zone was fixed about 16 miles east of Mount McKinley, the mountain many now call Denali. This specific location transitioned the operation from an open-ended search into a defined recovery planning phase. The transport did not come down in a flat valley or an accessible river basin. The debris lay high on a glacier-clad peak that would later be named Mount Deception, with wreckage and signs extending down the steep ice. At that elevation, ground teams face continuous low temperatures, treacherous glacial footing, and reduced oxygen levels. The terrain in that sector of the Alaska Range consists of heavily crevassed glaciers and steep rock faces. An expedition into that high ice requires specialized logistical support simply to sustain life during the long approach. Traditional recovery teams trained for flat terrain cannot operate safely on that kind of slope. The approach route alone demands traversing miles of shifting ice fields before even reaching the actual base of the peak holding the wreckage. In 1944, helicopters existed, but none had the lift, range, or reliability to place men and heavy gear onto a steep glacier face in the Alaska Range. Supplies, rations, and recovery tools still had to move overland or on human backs, and route planning had to match what deep snow could bear and what a team on foot could sustain each day. The isolation invalidated normal timelines. Planners had precise coordinates but no practical approach, and any extraction would have to be hauled back down the same glaciated terrain. The primary objective of recovering the missing personnel now depended entirely on overcoming this isolated high-altitude geography. With the wreckage fixed on the map, planners now had to judge whether a ground party could function on a steep glacier face at 9,700 feet, and what failure mechanism had driven a heavy transport into the ice. The critical unknown was what catastrophic mechanism forced a heavy military transport out of the sky and into the side of a glacier. Navigating a heavy transport aircraft through marginal weather forces a strict operational trade-off between instrument reliance and the immediate risk of fatal terrain collision. In the Alaska Range, that weather can collapse into cloud, turbulence, and icing, and any ice accumulation can rapidly alter the wing's aerodynamic profile, reducing lift while adding weight. In such conditions, a strong downdraft can erase the last margin between controlled flight and terrain. To keep the aircraft flying, the crew went fully onto instruments, holding airspeed and attitude while weather erased any visual ground reference. That focus cost them precise tracking, and the aircraft drifted laterally until it was no longer inside its safer corridor. In the interior Alaska Range, a lateral deviation of 35 miles forces the aircraft out of a verified valley navigation corridor and directly into uncharted solid granite and ice peaks. the flight crew was flying blind in the weather and losing altitude while drifting laterally over completely unforgiving topography. The heavy transport eventually encountered the severe grade of the uncharted peak, later designated Mount Deception. The aircraft struck the solid ice belly first. What investigators could state with confidence was written into the ice. The aircraft did not stop cleanly. It hit high on the mountain and then tore and slid down slope, scattering wreckage across a steep face. As best the ground party could later determine, the transport struck high on Mount Deception and plunged about 1,600 feet down the ice to its resting place. An engine near the point of impact protruded from the ice at nearly 12,000 feet above sea level. The men found undisputable evidence from the crash: blood on the fuselage, a canvas suitcase, a whiskey bottle, and other items. But those surface clues did not yield the bodies commanders demanded. Deep snow, about 10 feet fallen since the crash, frustrated all attempts to locate any remains. Whatever the initiating failure had been, the mountain had already sealed the scene into steep ice, crevasses, and winter snowpack, turning recovery into a calculation of risk with almost no margin. Refusing a high-risk mission based on geographical reality directly conflicts with institutional demands for evidence retrieval. When a crash site rests on an extreme vertical incline, local experts evaluate the hazard profile before committing personnel. Park Superintendent Grant Pearson initially analyzed the proposed mountain operation and demurred. He warned that it would be too risky to descend a 50-degree icy slope for a body recovery operation. In his assessment, the mountain's geometry made the mission capable of generating secondary casualties among the rescuers themselves. This local terrain safety assessment was immediately countermanded by a rigid institutional directive. United States Army Air Force's Colonel Ivan Palmer issued a strict demand for a full recovery operation. The military directive was not based on newly discovered geographical safety margins or improved weather windows. The order was driven entirely by a distinct political mandate. Among the dead was the son of a United States congressman. This specific institutional pressure converted the operation from an impossible environmental problem into a mandatory tactical objective. The military chain of command required positive identification and retrieval of high profile remains overriding all local hazard assessments. This mandate forced Pearson into accepting an extreme hazard profile. The superintendent was compelled to design a ground approach that could somehow survive the very terrain he had just diagnosed as structurally unstable and inherently unsurvivable. To execute this mandated operation, Pearson had to overwhelm the geographical isolation with meticulous logistics and heavy manpower. A small insertion team would lack the physical endurance to transport required survival gear across the vast Alaska range. To execute this mandated operation, Pearson had to overwhelm the geographical isolation with meticulous logistics and heavy manpower. A small insertion team would lack the physical endurance to transport required survival gear across the vast Alaska range. Pearson systematically built a large rescue and investigation expedition, about 40 men depending on how attached personnel were counted. Managing a team of that size in a frozen wilderness requires an unbroken supply chain of cold weather rations, aviation fuel for stoves, and heavy winter equipment. Every ounce of weight had to be justified against the caloric burn required to move it. Moving this mass of personnel and material strictly on foot from the nearest staging area would exhaust the team before they ever reached the primary ascent zone. To solve the initial distance constraint, the expedition deployed specialized mechanized support. The party used 2 military snow tractors to drive through blizzard conditions to Wonder Lake. From there, they headed south to McGonigal Pass and on to the upper Muldrow Glacier, pushing supplies forward to a workable staging camp on the ice. By applying mechanized power to the lower elevation transit, the expedition preserved the physical strength of the human team for the high-risk climbing that still lay ahead. Reaching the base of the mountain immediately triggered the next hard operational limit. The mechanical advantage of the snow tractors ended abruptly where the vertical rock and ice began. Superintendent Pearson knew the standard military personnel in his 44-man team lacked the specialized high-altitude climbing experience required to survive the upper slopes. The terrain angle dictated that a single misstep on the high ice would result in a fatal fall for any unroped searcher. Furthermore, putting dozens of inexperienced climbers onto an avalanche slope simultaneously would guarantee a slide. To mitigate this extreme climbing constraint, Pearson recruited specialized technical expertise. He asked experienced climber Bradford Washburn, camped near Wonder Lake, to lend a hand. When Washburn reached Pearson's camp, the two men led a smaller party over the Alaska Range and, clinging onto ropes, down to the crash site. The expedition had successfully bypassed the long lower transit and established a highly capable forward camp. Washburn and Pearson now faced the sheer face of the objective mountain. With heavy gear staged at the base and no way to drive higher, the remaining problem was the wall itself. How to bridge the final gap up a vertical ice face. Gaining access to wreckage located on an extreme vertical incline requires overriding the geometry of the mountain itself. When investigators cannot simply walk to a debris site, they must manually carve a physical infrastructure directly into the ice. To breach the final frozen barrier isolating the heavy transport debris, the lead technical searchers cut steps straight into the upper face of the mountain. The target face holding the wreckage was a continuous 50-degree icy avalanche slope. Operating on that grade places investigators outside normal safety margins. To counter the terrain angle and protect the recovery personnel, the climbing team fixed ropes down the chute, creating a controlled corridor of movement on the ice. Even so, the entire investigation was restricted to what could be reached while securely protected by those rope lines. Moving laterally away from the central line to examine scattered anomalies required unacceptable risk. Working methodically down the rope lines, the search team reached the primary impact zone just below the upper elevations of Mount Deception, a little over 11,000 feet high. Operating under extreme wind chill while suspended on the steep slope, the team commenced their visual survey. The wreckage was shattered and scattered across the face, but the men could still confirm they had found the missing transport. They documented what the mountain left exposed: surface artifacts and torn structure. Yet the human evidence they were ordered to retrieve remained absent from the surface. With the slope steep, the snowpack unstable, and crevasses hidden, excavation had to remain limited and cautious. The team could not safely dig widely enough to resolve where the occupants had gone beneath the ice. Excavating an aircraft frame at high altitude while attached to climbing ropes demands enormous caloric output and strictly limits the volume of snow that can be cleared. The searchers successfully chipped away the frozen crust surrounding the ruined flight deck and the cleanly severed tail section. These anchored metal structures proved the definitive identity and the absolute destruction of the missing airframe. The investigation team had mapped the extreme limits of the shattered aluminum shell. The structural remnants were anchored, but where was the payload of human evidence? When investigators reach a shattered airframe, they expect to locate the missing payload in the immediate vicinity of the heavy structural components. The expedition mapped the primary wreckage but encountered a massive discrepancy. All 19 men vanished from the visible debris field. The search team stood on the high slope surrounded by the aluminum remnants of the military transport, but the human remains were completely absent from the surface. Finding the heavy metal structures did not solve the primary mandate of the recovery operation. The investigators had to locate the ejected contents of the broken aircraft. Scanning the steep, frozen incline, the searchers successfully documented a scattering of detached surface artifacts. They located a canvas suitcase, a heavy glass whiskey bottle, and a pilot flight bag resting lightly on the snow. Cataloging these minor personal items provided a definitive positive knowledge gain. It proved that the interior contents of the transport were violently dispersed across the immediate area. However, while these lightweight items remained on the surface, they highlighted the complete absence of the heavy cargo and the human occupants. The detached evidence confirmed a wide dispersal pattern but offered zero immediate clues to the location of the missing servicemen. The surrounding terrain geometry dictated the exact physical location of the heavy payload. The mountain slope was not a smooth, continuous ramp. The glacier face was heavily fractured with deep, naturally occurring crevasses. Due to the local gravity and the surface geometry of the avalanche chute, the heavy cargo and the human occupants were forced directly into these deep glacial fissures. These natural ice traps swallowed the payload, isolating it entirely from the surface level. To recover the missing personnel, the investigation team needed access to the deep crevasses. But between the crash and the climb, roughly 10 feet of new snow buried the chute, sealing the fissures and smoothing the broken face into a deceptive surface. That new snow layer fundamentally changed the site, Under its own weight, it compressed toward dense ice, creating a thick barrier between the team and the crevasses that had swallowed the payload. Reaching those fissures would have meant excavating deep while balanced on a steep incline, work that demanded industrial rotary equipment or heavy mechanical shovels. None of that machinery could be transported up the vertical face, and attempting to trench across a wide dispersal area with hand tools would have exhausted the climbers while increasing avalanche risk. The snowpack left the crevasses hidden and the bodies beyond confirmation. Command now had to choose between blind digging on a lethal slope and a controlled withdrawal. Despite securing the target coordinates and mapping the separated aluminum structures, 0 victims were recovered from the frozen slope. The expedition command faced a definitive operational limit. The physical barrier protecting the deep ice fissures could not be breached by human stamina and manual hand tools. Continuing the excavation effort offered no mathematical probability of success. Furthermore, maintaining a large ground force on the steep incline simply to dig blindly introduced severe secondary risks to the specialized climbing team. Recognizing this absolute physical boundary, the park superintendent and the lead technical searcher issued a final procedural decision. The primary extraction objective was officially aborted. The climbing team began their calculated withdrawal from the high-altitude zone, leaving the heavy fuselage sections anchored in the snow. Relaying this operational abort back to United States Army Air Forces Command required a precise articulation of the environmental facts. The initial military directive demanded total recovery based on high-profile political pressure and strict institutional requirements. However, political mandates cannot alter geological constraints or eliminate immediate operational hazards. The ground team provided empirical evidence that the entire payload was permanently entombed beneath an impenetrable layer of compacted ice and snow. They established that no amount of additional manpower could safely alter the physical state of the wreckage zone. The mountain had sealed the interior contents of the transport plane away from any standard forensic intervention. The military chain of command was forced to process a distinct operational failure dictated entirely by the local geography. The failure defined recovery infeasibility when access angle, burial depth, and the absence of deployable excavation capability combine into an unsolved equation. A site becomes unrecoverable when the resources needed to extract remains would either guarantee additional deaths or require technology that cannot be delivered to the coordinates. Although the primary physical extraction was blocked, the expedition successfully secured a definitive historical baseline. By dispatching the ground team and physically reaching the isolated coordinates, the military transformed an open-ended disappearance into a documented material loss. The investigators mapped the precise location of the isolated peak and verified the total destruction of the heavy airframe. They confirmed beyond all doubt that there were 0 survivors requiring medical evacuation. This direct observation closed the active search file. The military now possessed verified data confirming exactly where the heavy transport went down and why the site remained forever inaccessible. This formal establishment of the Mount Deception baseline provided the final operational closure for the original flight, preventing any further hazardous search missions in the surrounding valleys. With the conclusion accepted, the mission shifted from recovery to remembrance. The military accepted the expedition's conclusion that the victims lay buried beyond recovery beneath ice and snow. After a memorial service at Elmendorf Field, a transport aircraft later flew over the mountain and dropped floral wreaths onto the snowbound landscape. The wreckage remained where it had fallen, and the glacier became the final custodian, its crevasses and shifting ice holding what the rescuers could not reach.